Welcome to Paranormal Heart Podcast with host Kat Ward. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Paranormal Heart Podcast, Paranormal Talk with Heart and Soul. Tonight's segment is pre-recorded, streaming on United Public Radio Network, 107.7 New Orleans, 105.3 the Gulf Coast, YouTube, and any place you find your favorite podcast. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. I appreciate your time. So, folks, I have another great guest for you tonight, author of the official Dracula prequel, J.D.Barker. J.D.Barker is a New York Times and international best-selling author whose stories blur the line between reality and nightmare. Known for weaving together suspense, horror, crime, and the supernatural, Barker pulls readers into dark, twisting worlds where nothing is ever as it seems. Handpicked by the Stoker family to continue Bram Stoker's legacy, he also co-authors best-selling novels with James Patterson and has written several acclaimed standalones, including his newest release, Something I Keep Upstairs, a true master of modern thriller with a haunting edge. Barker's name has become synonymous with gripping and unforgettable storytelling. So without further ado, please help me welcome J.D. Barker. Hello.
Hey. I'm going to have you follow me around and read that off every time I walk into a room. That was perfect.
Oh, thank you. It took me a while to write it. I just couldn't get the words right, but I finally got it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I appreciate your time as well. Thank you. So I would like to first ask, how does someone who has a background in finance become an author and have your first book published at the age of 43?
That's easy. Nobody wants to work in finance. I hated it. So I got to backtrack a little bit. So I grew up without a TV in the house. I was reading at like a really early age. We were always hitting the library. So I always had my head buried in a book. I've got a sister who's 15 months younger than me. So as early as I can remember, I would write up stories. I would staple them together, and I created like a library in my room, and she would check them out, and I would charge her late fees. So like this started a long time ago. And my parents encouraged writing as a hobby, but they always added, that little bit of a caveat, like writing is a great hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So I did what I was told to do. I finished up high school. I went off to college. I got a couple of degrees, ended up working behind a desk, and I hated every second of it. And while all that was going on, I was also writing basically in my spare time, wherever I could squeeze it in. Back when I was in college, I started working for newspapers and magazines, as I was going to school. And, when you work with, like people in that industry, you quickly realize they've all got a novel at some stage of development in a desk drawer somewhere, like every reporter does. It's 400,000 words long. They've been working on it for 10 years. It's almost done, but like they keep going back to it. And I was very good with grammar and punctuation. So they started handing those off to me to kind of go through. After a while, that turned into a job as a developmental editor that I did on the side. Then I became what's called a book doctor, and I did some ghostwriting. So I would do all that stuff while I was finishing up college and while I was working in finance. So ultimately, my last real day job, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is as horrible as it sounds. I did it for 23 years. After I would work 40 to 60 hours a week, and then I would come home and I would write, work on these projects. And over those 2 decades, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list that all came out with other people's names on the cover that I had essentially written. Which gets really old after a while. So that was basically the point where my wife and I decided it's time to make this, writing thing, give it a go and see if we can make it happen. And I was 42, 43 at the time.
Wow, that's amazing. To do a job for so long that you really didn't enjoy, that must have been like torture.
Well, the thing is, everybody, I think, gets trapped in this, or a lot of people do. You get out of school, you start earning a decent paycheck, then you get a car, you get a house, so you've got rent, all these bills start piling up, and before you know it, you're stuck, and that's kind of the position we were in. I had a fantastic salary, but we had the lifestyle based on that salary. So, we had a big car, our big house, we had cars, we had a boat. So ultimately, when we sat down to try and make the writing thing happen, our monthly nut was somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000 that we had to cover. So like I couldn't just
Mm,
walk away from the day job.
yeah.
So we were trapped. When my wife came up with this crazy plan, we sold everything that we owned. So we basically got out of all that. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh, rented out one side to some tenants, and moved into the other side and got our monthly expenses down to literally nothing, to the point where we could live off of savings. And that's when I worked on the first book. And I remember I had about 18 months worth of life left in the bank account before I'd have to
Oh,
get another real job. So like I had my
yeah.
feet to the fire, and I think that's what I really needed. I needed to get out of that comfort zone.
Yeah, it's not easy to do either. Um,
No.
so I understand a real haunted house helped to inspire your latest novel. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it shaped the story?
Sorry, you cut out for a second there. We've got a
Oh, did I?
storm coming in. I live on an island in
Oh,
in, in New England, and like our internet gets flaky when the weather gets bad.
oh, not a problem. If it gets too bad, we can always reschedule as well. That's not a problem.
Okay.
Okay,
I missed that last question.
that's okay. So I understand a real haunted house helped you inspire your latest novel. Just wanted to know if you could touch on that and how it helped you shape the story.
Yeah, so I've got an app on my phone where I just write down every possible idea I have for books. And one of the taglines that I had in there for years, I knew I wanted to write a haunted house story. I knew I
Mhm.
didn't want to write the same haunted house story that everybody else tells. Like a husband
Yeah.
and wife buy this fixer upper, they move in, something bad happens, something worse happens, they realize something really bad happened, and then other things happen, and then either have a happy ending or a negative ending or whatever. But like it's that same story rehashed over and over. So I started just looking at the core of haunted house stories, and this idea popped into my mind, which became the tagline for the book: "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So
Hmm.
in my novel, I've got a kid. He's 17 years old. His grandmother passes away, and she lived on a little house on a private island right off the coast where he lived. And he didn't really know her at all. He knew she was out there, but she would, the families were estranged, so they didn't talk. But she leaves him this house on a private island. He's 17 years old, so he does exactly what you would expect a 17-year-old kid to do. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends. It's away from the parents, away from the police. Someplace where they can go and get a little bit of privacy. So they party for a little while, but that gets old. And then at some point, somebody raises their hand and say, "Hey, what would it take to turn this house into a haunted house?" Again, perfectly normal house. So they start exactly where you would expect. There's a couple of scary stories. Then somebody brings in a Ouija board, and things basically escalate. But the tagline for the book: "For a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die." So where
Hmm.
they're going, but the book, the story is all about the journey. So I had that idea for the longest time. And once my book started taking off, my wife and I, we were still living in Pittsburgh. We realized we don't have to live in Pittsburgh. We started looking all over the country, and we found this tiny little island off the coast of Portsmouth in New England called Newcastle. And that's where we ultimately landed. And every day I quit work around 3 o'clock. I quit writing, and I go for a run around the island. It's 4.2 miles. And at one point I'm standing out on the beach. And when I stand out on the beach, I can see Wood Island, which is where this house is in real life.
Hmm.
And it's just far enough off the coast where you can't really tell what's going on out there. It's very small. The island is only about an acre. There's only one house on it. But every once in a while you see a light come on, or you see a person walking on the beach. So I kind of paired those two things up. I had the idea for the haunted house story, and then at one point it just clicked in my brain: what if that was the haunted house? And then I started researching the history of that particular island, and started finding, learning some of the things that had happened out there over hundreds of years. And honestly, it was perfect. So I just took basically a blend of fact and fiction and put it all together in creating the novel. Normally I could write a book in about 3 months. This one took me about 4 years from start to finish, just because
Wow.
of all the little intricate patterns and things that kind of came together.
And there's probably a lot more research involved in this one compared to some others?
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, I learned that at one point the island was used as a quarantine zone for yellow fever.
Oh,
So if
wow.
somebody in the New England area got yellow fever, they would literally put them out there on an island and wait for them to die. During the Spanish American War, they used to capture ships, and they would dock them out there, and they would keep everybody on the ship until everybody passed away, either from starvation or disease. And then they would take the boat, because that's all they really cared about. The bodies would go overboard. They were food for the sharks. And this kind of thing went on for like, I traced things like this back almost 400 years through local history, just one crazy event after another. The most recent one I could find was in 1972. Somebody was out there picnicking. They boated out there. It's the only way to get out there is by boat. They were on the beach and they found two bodies on the beach buried in the sand. So they called the Kittery Police Department, which is the local PD. They came out. They said, well, this isn't really our jurisdiction. The island itself is right on the border of Maine and New Hampshire. So it basically became like a jurisdictional hot potato. Like on TV, everybody always wants the murder. Like we don't want to give up this case. Like the cops always want it. In real life, if it's not a solvable case, they want to get rid of it as fast as possible. They don't want it on the books. So all the local law enforcement kind of passed it back and forth. Ultimately, they called in the FBI. They figured, well, it's federal land. It's up to the FBI to figure this out. So I found one newspaper article detailing all of this. And there's a picture of the local DA standing out there with law enforcement, literally standing over the bodies. So we know it all happened. But in today's world, nobody's got a record of it. None of the local police departments have any kind of file on it. Local FBI has no record of it. The bodies have completely vanished. Nobody knows who they were or what happened to them. So that happened in the 70s. And the cool thing is with this book coming out, it came out in May, the FBI has actually reopened the investigation to try and figure it out. So we'll see if it might actually lead to something. But I found all these crazy, horrible events that took place on this island. And we've had a lot of paranormal investigators out there. And the one theory that just keeps coming up is the bulk of them feel that when something dies, everything is energy based. So if something passes away, that energy doesn't disappear; it just goes somewhere else. And if a lot of bad things happen all in the same place, it's almost like a battery getting a charge, which is, I think, what we feel when we actually go out there. Because it gives me the heebie-jeebies to stand out there on that island. Like you feel like something is off, like you don't want to be there. Like your lizard brain is telling you, get away from this place. It's the weirdest thing.
Does it look creepy and feel creepy, or does it look really beautiful? Like if you were to look at it, you figured, well, there's nothing really bad that happened there. Or is it just the feeling?
Well, I've seen different iterations of it. When I first heard about the house had been abandoned for almost 50 years. So it was falling down. A local politician or a local person basically took it upon himself to reinvigorate it. So he started raising money, raised millions of dollars to basically bring the house back to life. So I saw it at the beginning of all that when it was falling apart. And I saw it again now. And in today's world, it's a museum. They've completely restored it. So everything looks brand new. But, it's weird. Like, you could take like the Lizzie Borden house, you could slap a new coat of paint on the wall. That doesn't mean something bad didn't happen there. And a lot of people will still feel that something bad when they walk into it, even if they don't know about it. And that's what this is like. You walk in, everything looks shiny and new, but something just feels off. You can't quite put your finger on what it is.
That's wild. I would actually like to go there sometime because I do have a background as a paranormal investigator. But wow, that would be really interesting. So your books cross genres like thrillers, horror, crime, supernatural. What draws you to these elements of storytelling?
Well, I think it goes back to the childhood stuff. So when I was a kid, I read everything. I started with Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews. Then I moved on to like the classics like Charles Dickens and stuff like that. My mom owned an antique store and we used to hit a lot of garage sales.
Amazing.
And I remember one day there was a guy, he had a box of books and sitting on top was a copy of Dracula. I was 8 years old. I picked it up. It looked super scary. I showed it to my mom. I figured there's no way she's going to let me buy this one. It was 25 cents, but she let me buy it. I took it home and I read it. And it took me about 3 weeks or so. And I slept with the lights on for like the longest time after that. Like it scared the bejesus out of me. And that's the first time a book had ever really done that. Like got that type of an emotional reaction out of me. And honestly, I think I've been chasing that feeling ever since as both a reader and a writer, trying to recreate it. So horror, I think, is my first love as a writer. I do a lot of work in the thriller world. So, in my publication thing, I kind of bounce back and forth. I do a horror novel, then I do a thriller, do another horror. And I found that just by doing that, it aggravates the hell out of my agents and my publishers because they don't quite know how to sell me. But it's almost like working like a literary Pied Piper, like rather than just having a thriller audience, I have a thriller audience and a horror audience. So I've learned over the years to kind of use the books to kind of expand my audience overall. At one point, my publishers told me that my audience was women 45 and over. So I wrote a young adult book and all of a sudden my audience, the demographics shifted and I started bringing them in as, younger and younger. So I try to use the books themselves as a way to expand who's reading me.
That is amazing because you don't want to fall in that same cookie cutter author genre type thing.
Yeah, I don't want to go off into the weeds on the business side of things, but like that's, when you're first getting published and you send your book off to an agent, the first thing they do is they try to put a label on you. You are a this author, you are a that author. That's how they sell you to the editor. The editor walks down the hallway to the marketing department, tells them the same thing. That marketing department calls the bookstores, and that's how the bookstore knows where to put you on the shelf. So it's real important for them. But as an author, if you're trying to build a brand, you want the biggest possible audience you could possibly have. So if you have this fine line that you're trying to walk, there's only a handful of readers out there. You really want to expand beyond that. And I think a lot of that, from my standpoint, I've just gotten from working with somebody like James Patterson. Like, he has taught me so much on the business side. He does the same thing. At one point, he was looking at his audience, and he decided, well, I'm going to write a book with Bill Clinton. And he expanded his audience, tremendously by doing that. Then he did it again a few years ago. He wrote a book with Dolly Parton and roped in another whole, group of people that weren't reading him. And about 2 months ago, he announced a book that he's writing with Mr. Beast, who's the #1 YouTube star. So again, he's just expanding his audience again by tapping into a group that, at this point probably isn't reading him, and they will be.
Mm-hmm. I do understand the business point of view, but as a reader, like I said, you don't want to fall into that cookie cutter. It's just refreshing as a reader.
Yeah, I feel the same way because I read so much, and like the one thing I hate is to pick up a book by an author and have it, basically be the same book but different over and over and over. And knowing a lot of authors, the authors don't want to write that same book over and over again, but the publishers kind of make them do it. So I go out of my way to make sure that every book is completely different from the last.
And as a reader, I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's like my favorite authors, guys like Stephen King and Dean Koontz, and I buy their books because their name is on the cover. I don't even read the back. Like, I don't care what it's about. Like, I know that I'm going to get a particular voice. I know they're going to entertain me, and I'd rather go in blind. And that's kind of what I try to produce.
That's how I feel with some movies. If there's a particular actor that I really enjoy, I don't care what the storyline's about. I'm going to watch the movie.
Yep.
So what was so you did co-write, as you mentioned, with James Patterson. What was it like collaborating with him? And is the process different than when you're writing solo?
Well, I spent so many years, working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, basically collaborating with other people for 2 decades, that when I sat down to actually write my own book, that felt weird. Because all of a sudden there's nobody else weighing in on the decisions. It's just me all by myself and, behind the desk. So it feels more natural to me to work with other people. With somebody like Patterson, like we've had a very weird relationship because I've got all these books behind me. You kind of see them on the video. There's only 2 up there that are actually on the process of writing. One is Strunk and White, which gives me every rule in the grammar, world that I need to know. The other one is On Writing by Stephen King. And in On Writing, Stephen King says that he's what they call a pantser. So he basically creates his plot, his characters. He drops these people into some kind of crazy scenario, and then he just lets the story play out on paper. He doesn't outline, he doesn't plan anything ahead, he doesn't know where the story is going, and he feels that if he doesn't know where the story is going, the reader's not going to be able to figure it out, and that's what keeps it interesting, which makes perfect logical sense. So the first few books that I wrote in that format. And if you fast forward a couple of years, when James Patterson reached out, I was on my, I think, second or third book had been published. He had read a book I'd written called The Fourth Monkey, and asked if I wanted to meet for lunch and talk about possibly working together. And the first thing that we did is, I brought up that I'm a pantser. He brought up that he's a notorious outliner. He creates 30 to 50 pages before he starts writing the book. So we both came at this process from very different camps, and we didn't think we'd be able to work together because of that. So I walked away from that meeting thinking, well, I just had lunch with James Patterson. That's a win. It doesn't really have to go any further than that. But a couple months later, we touched base again. And he said, you know what? Let's try it your way. Let's try to pants a novel. So I'm the only person who's ever gotten James Patterson to write a book without an outline. And we went back and forth. Like, I would write a chapter, I would paint him into what I felt was some, this crazy, impossible scenario. I'd send him off the pages thinking he's never going to get out of this. And then 15 minutes later, he'd send me new pages. And not only did he get out of it, but he put me into some other crazier situation. We went back and forth like that. And it's the twistiest book I think I've ever written to date. But when we finished it up, he said, okay, we tried it your way. Let's try it my way. And he sent me an outline for a book called The Noise. And I saw just, in writing that, how much more efficient and how easy the process was when you have the whole story down there on paper.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of it comes down to, like, if I think about my general day, like I mentioned, I go on a run every day. I do that every day at 3 o'clock. And when I was pantsing a novel while I was on that run, I would use that time to figure out what comes next in the story, what comes next, so that when I started the next day, I could kind of hit the ground running. But when I've got an outline in front of me, I already know what comes next. So I can use that same brain power to figure out, how do I make what comes next better, and tweak it. And I think the books are much better for it.
I went back to school a few years ago, and I had to learn how to write essays and things like that. And I found it very difficult. You have that template of how an essay is supposed to be written, and I had a really difficult time. So I just decided to write it the way that I thought. I had a general idea of what I wanted to write, but I just kind of let it flow. And for me, that worked. And the professor didn't even notice, thankfully, that I didn't use the template.
It's one of those things. So when they give you a formula, if they tell you, okay, you've got to write this and you need to write a 3-act structure, now all of a sudden you're trying to force that story to fit. And, in a lot of ways, it can be like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. Like you can make it work if you have to, but you're forcing it in there. But, if you learn to just rely on your subconscious, like I read so much that the actual structure of a story is ingrained in my head. Like my mind knows at this point a twist needs to happen. Climax needs to start here. This needs to happen here. And if I go beyond that point without that thing happening, it's almost like I missed a turn on the highway for some destination. So I'm able to kind of see that, and I've learned to trust my subconscious over the years and kind of follow along with that. But when you're in school and the teachers are trying to force you to do it, it's so rigid, in a lot of ways it's detrimental.
Yeah, like I said, I had a really rough time, and I thought, I'm just going to wing it and see what happens. And thankfully, it worked for me.
Yeah.
How does someone who has oh, nope, sorry, that's my other sheet. I apologize. I totally lost my notes got mixed up for some reason. Please bear with me. I do apologize.
Oh, no worries.
So I know you've spoken a lot about the prequel to Dracula, but if you're okay with it, can we touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. That was a dream project for me.
I absolutely love that book.
It's a great book. I had mentioned I read it when I was a kid, and it's one of those books that I've reread over and over, as I've gotten older, and I always seem to take away, something a little different every time I revisit it again. For that particular project, my very first novel, it was called Forsaken. I got really lucky. Stephen King let me use some of his characters in it, which was a huge bump when the book first came out. It was up for the Bram Stoker Award for Best Debut Novel. And when I went to the Horror Writers Convention for the award ceremony, at one point there was a book signing, and they sat me next to Dacre Stoker, who is Bram's great grandnephew. We were together for about an hour, and we talked the whole time. I picked his brain on Bram Stoker. He talked, brought up my history as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, and we just kind of went back and forth on all that. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was actually a job interview. He pulled me aside the next day, and he said, "Listen, I'm going to be honest with you. My family has been trying to find somebody to write a prequel to Dracula for a very long time, using Bram's original notes and journals. Is that something you'd be interested in doing?" And the answer to that question is yes. You always say yes when somebody asks you that. And then he spun two things on me that I never saw coming. He told me that Bram originally wrote Dracula as a true story. He personally believed in vampires to the point where he was cremated when he died. He's worried about his immortal soul being taken. And also that the Dracula that we know is actually, it doesn't start where we think it does. Like the book that we've all read, it starts with Jonathan Harker on the train. That's actually page 102 of the original novel. So when Bram wrote Dracula, the first 100 pages was very autobiographical. It basically explained why he thought vampires were real. When he turned it into his publisher pushed it back across the desk and said, "We can't put this out. It's going to scare people too much." This was a time in history when Jack the Ripper was active in London. People firmly believed in the paranormal. So like it was just one of those things. So they made him strip all this stuff out. Bram needed the money, so he did what they said. He stripped those 100-some pages out. So what we basically put together years, we recreated Bram's original story, what he was trying to tell in those first 100 pages, which was fun in and of itself because we had to work through his journals and the notes and things and everything he left behind. But when we finished, we wanted to verify what we had because, there are people who have doctorates in Dracula, so we knew we had to get this right before we could put it out. But nobody actually has a copy of those first 100 pages. There's one known manuscript of Dracula that's ever been found. It was found in a barn in Pennsylvania. Nobody really knows how it got there. Paul Allen bought it at auction through Christie's for a little under $1 million a few years back. So I knew that he had it. So I reached out to Paul Allen's people, and they allowed Baker and I to fly out to Seattle and actually sit down in a conference room and go through it. So they locked us in this room. They took away our cell phones so we couldn't take pictures, made us wear gloves, and they wheeled in the original Dracula manuscript. First thing we did is we opened up the cover, turned to that first page, hoping to see number 1. And it was there, but it was right behind it, crossed out 102. So the first 100 pages were missing. It still started at page 102. Bram had wrote the title Dracula up at the top. So we thought it was gone, but then we started flipping through the pages and we realized, like in today's world, if I delete a scene, I hit delete, it's gone. But in Bram's time, this manuscript was typed, so if he deleted a scene, he drew a line through it. Yeah. So we started focusing on those deleted scenes, everything that he took out of the book. And we quickly realized they referenced things from the very first 100 pages, which is why he took them out. And using that, we were able to confirm the other information we had and basically piece together the rest of that book. It was called Dracul. It came out in, I think, 2017. It's a great book, though. Yeah.
So I wasn't trying to. I'm just so excited about this book. I haven't read your book yet. I look forward to doing it because I absolutely loved Bram Stoker's Dracula because I just loved the style of writing in that genre and the wording. There's just something that makes you able to fall into the book and you're able to feel like you're there. I really enjoyed that. But so you didn't actually have the notes and the journal yourself. You had to go. Like you're not in possession of those?
I don't have any of that anymore. The Stoker family still has all of it.
Yeah. But still being able to have access to that. I mean,
how
did you feel?
It was wild. I mean, like if I look at my desk behind me and there's little notes and stuff like that, and that's essentially what they had from Bram. Like he had notes written on laundry receipts, like any kind of scrap of paper that he could find, he would write on. He plotted out a big portion of the novel in a daytimer. He was a theater manager, so he had access to daytimers, and like it makes perfect sense. At 3 o'clock, Mina does this. At 4 o'clock, she does this. So he plugged it in on the daytimer, and then just throughout his journal, like he wrote down everything. He took notes about just about everything. So you'd see 2 or 3 random entries about stuff, and then 1 entry about Dracula. We found, he actually wrote Dracula when he was in his 40s, and we found notes dating all the way back to when he was 16, where he actually started researching it. So vampires were a big part of his life, his entire life.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed the lore of the vampires ever since I was a little girl. So that's obviously why I enjoyed reading the book. But so when you were approached by the Stoker family, can you explain to us how you felt?
Obviously very special. I mean, with it being one of my favorite books and then being able to be part of it, the whole experience was fantastic. I think there was a couple of moments that were very surreal for me. After the book was done, we had to go out on the tour for the book. And at one point we were in Dublin, which is where a large portion of the book actually takes place. That's where Bram is actually from. He's not from the UK. So while we were but like I knew Dublin up till that point just through Bram Stoker's notes. So when he described a church or he described a street, it was his version of it in early 1900s. So when I actually went to Dublin, like I saw all those things. Here's a church that Bram was talking about, but right next to it is a bank, or McDonald's or something like that. So it was very weird. Like I could see Bram's world superimposed on our world. And then when we visited his house from his childhood home in Clontarf, and started walking through those places like that, it felt like Bram was with us the entire time.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, like you said, the honor of having access to all that information to be able to write the prequel is just amazing.
Yeah, he was a very smart guy too, because his UK publisher made him strip out those 100 pages, but he really wanted to tell that story. So when he sent off copies to his foreign publishers, he actually left those parts in. Because like in today's world, if I write a book, I send one copy off to my English publisher and that's it. They distribute it off to the foreign guys. I don't really touch it beyond that point.
Okay.
But in Bram's time, he actually mailed off those different copies. So when they wanted to put it out in Germany, he sent a copy off to Germany. He sent one off to France, one off to Italy. But Dracula is kind of a weird phenomenon. It's the second most purchased book in the world next to the Bible.
The Bible,
So extremely popular, but it's also in public domain. So when you go on Amazon and you buy a copy of Dracula, like when they put that together, all they do is they go out and they grab the public domain text of Dracula, they format it and put out a book. So nobody is going back to these actual, the first editions of this book. And one of the things the Stoker family realized is if they buy a first edition of Dracula in some foreign language and then translate it back to English, they started finding all these parts that Bram had taken out of the UK version. So he basically left breadcrumbs of the original story. And a lot of the foreign editions are different. You go one country to the next, there's major differences in the book.
That's interesting. That must have been a lot of work for him to send them to all these different places.
Yeah, I mean, that's just how it was back then. It's just been streamlined a little bit.
Amazing. So your career's shown that you're not afraid to take risks and step outside of the norm. Why do you believe authors must dare to think differently?
I think it's important, if you take a step back and not look at this as being an author, look at it as being somebody who produces a product, and you are the brand. Look at other brands, like what do they do to stand out? Like if you're selling cereal, you look at your market, you expand based on where, what people like, what they don't like. I tend to look at being an author the same way, like I mentioned with the books, how I use them to expand my audience. I try to do everything that way. Whenever I have a book coming out, I usually make a list of what I see other people doing to promote their titles. And then I write another list of things nobody's doing. And then that's typically what I end up doing. So to give you an example for something I keep upstairs when it came out, because it's based on a real house that really exists, as part of the promotion, we actually gave an overnight stay away to one person in the haunted house. So we had a worldwide drawing, which we were able to promote. And that one person, they were allowed to pick 3 of their friends. We put them on a boat, took them out to the island, and we left them there for 24 hours. But like doing this particular contest, that created a ton of word of mouth, because I can buy ads all day long, just like any other author. But word of mouth is what really sells a book. So when you're giving away an overnight stay in a haunted house, people talk about it. They're all over Facebook. Like, I'll do it. Will you do it? I won't do it. I'll do it if you do it. But they're all chatting about it. They're all talking to their friends, and they're all spreading the word. And none of that costs you a penny. So I look for situations like that. Like word of mouth is what really sells books. I do whatever I can to build word of mouth.
Yeah, and it's difficult to find a good way to have that word of mouth. That's brilliant.
It is, but that's the fun of it. You try to find that one thing nobody is doing yet. And, unfortunately that one thing won't work again. Like if somebody else tries to duplicate it, so you have to be original about it. You got to come up with something unique.
Yeah. Do you find others are following in your footsteps with ideas like that?
They're trying, and honestly, it's flattering. And I also like the fact that they're doing it because it's taking people out of the norms, because, most authors tend to do the same thing. Most publishers tend to do the same thing. The last book that I turned into Random House, they sent me their marketing plan, and it's, basically a PowerPoint presentation. And it's the same presentation that I'd gotten for another book like 5 or 6 years earlier from them. They just kind of did a find and replace on a couple of graphics and titles, and that's it. They didn't change what they were actually doing to market a book. But, if you take a step back and you look at the world, like everything has changed, like what people are reading, how they're reading, what they're reading, everything is constantly moving. It's fluid, and you need to be just as fluid as an author or as a business owner if you want to stay in front of it.
Yep. Yeah, I know for me, even my coworkers, we discuss books. Hey, what are you reading? What genre do you like? So that's how we have the word of mouth that starts at work.
Yeah. And, that's what I'm looking to capture, that water cooler talk.
Yeah, exactly. So what's one thing you hope readers will walk away with after they're finished reading one of your books?
I'm just trying to entertain people. Like I really just try to give them an escape. The same reason I picked up books when I was a kid. I used it to, kind of get away from the real world for a little while. So that's all I'm trying to do with the stuff that I write. I'm not trying to sell a moral message or, you're not going to really learn anything walking away from one of my books. But you're going to have a good time actually reading it. Somebody once called what I write literary popcorn, which I think is probably the best way to describe it. You keep flipping those pages. It's no different than the way you eat popcorn. You just can't stop, and you enjoy every second of it.
Yeah. Can you just walk us through? So you write different genres of books. So how can you go from one genre and then you're going to go to another? How do you flip your mind to be able to write something different afterwards?
Well, for me, it all just comes down to the story. If you go to my Wikipedia page, they kind of summed it up really good there. They said that suspense is my common thread. I was told very early you have to have a common thread. I think that came from Dean Koontz.
Hmm.
And if you do that, the audience will follow along. So if you look at the books that I published, I basically followed his advice. The very first one was a horror novel. Second one was a thriller. Then I did the prequel to Dracula, which was another horror, then another thriller. And by bouncing back and forth and keeping that common thread of suspense, the readers are along for the ride. They're willing to make that genre jump with me. If you don't do that, I've gotten to talk to Patterson about this because he didn't do that. His very first book was called The Thomas Berriman Number, which I don't think he even has a copy of. Nobody bought that one. His second book was called Along Came a Spider, which was obviously a huge book about a serial killer. And then his next couple of books also about serial killers, basically that same book, but different. So his audience got conditioned to get that type of story from him. Then at one point he got bored. So he wrote a book about a girl with wings. And, his audience had a really hard time accepting that because it was so different from what they were expecting from him. It's two different camps, but, I learned that as long as you bounce back and forth and you do it from the get-go, everybody kind of expects that and they're willing to come along.
I think that's a brilliant strategy. I mean, like you just mentioned, an author can get easily bored writing the same old thing. So if you're jumping back and forth, it just helps. I think it also helps the reader because they can tell that you weren't bored writing the book.
Yeah, I'm scared to death of having to write the same story over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And I've got friends that are kind of stuck in that world. When I first started writing thrillers, I met Lee Child at Thriller Fest in New York, and Lee Child isn't his real name. If you go to his Wikipedia page, his real name is Jim Grant, so it's not a secret. But he wrote a bunch of different books under different pen names, and the Jack Reacher books just happened to take off. So before he knew it, he's writing a new Jack Reacher book once a year. He's known to the world as Lee Child, which isn't his real name. And, he's basically stuck in this kind of thing. And, he did it for as long as he could. And then he pulled the plug on it a couple of years back. He couldn't do it anymore. So I like to think I know he bought a ranch. I'm hoping that he's sitting on a porch somewhere writing that book that he really wanted to write. And we're going to see that come out under his real name, I hope, at some point.
That'll be interesting. Is there a book that you really, really want to write that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Pretty much every book on that list that I said of ideas that I have, I write the stories that I want to read that don't exist, so if I come up with an idea for something, I tend to put it down on paper myself.
Oh, again, I think that's brilliant because you're not followed. I hate to use the word cookie cutter so often, but that's what it is. But and it's going to be very, very interesting for the reader as well, because like I said earlier, I think a reader, at least I can tell when an author is kind of getting bored of writing the same old thing.
Yeah, I mean, you see it a lot, especially with a lot of the bigger name authors that hit the New York Times list over and over again. They put out a book once a year, and it's a very similar story. And the downside to that is when a reader discovers them, they read that first book from them, they love it. They pick up another book from them, and they love it just as much, but it feels very similar to the one they just read. And then they get into the third one, and it's again the same formula over again. Different characters, slightly different storyline, but it feels so similar. Typically they'll get maybe 3 to 4 books in before they're not necessarily give up on that author, but they're not going to binge them anymore. They're going to move on to something else and maybe come back to them at some later date. So I purposely try to write books that are just so different. My voice is consistent through all of them. I've got that common thread of suspense, but if you read something I keep upstairs and then you go back and read like one of my older titles like The Fourth Monkey, they're very, very different books. And I find that people just fly through my entire catalog because they're not getting that burnout factor that they do with some of the other authors. They're different enough where it keeps them going.
Yeah, my husband and I'm not going to mention the author, but there was a book that we had read, absolutely loved it. Read the second one, kind of similar, and I believe there was like 11 or 12 books in the series, and it was the same book every time, but we kept buying the books in hopes that the author was going to be changing. They never did, and the last few books we just never purchased, so I don't even know if the author did decide to change his writing style afterwards.
They might, but a lot of times the publisher won't let them, because they are selling a lot of books. And, if you make a change to that particular formula, they're worried about what's going to happen. What if it gets rejected and then nobody buys the next book? They would rather see a dwindle, slight downtick in the number of readers than a cliff.
I never even thought of that. Like, we were always kind of blaming the authors. Like, why is there nothing else that this individual can write about other than just they changed a few names, changed the location, but it's pretty much the same book. So this is eye-opening for myself that if I'm going to be reading a book, it's not the author's fault, it's the publisher.
No, I mean, I talk to them all, authors all the time. Like Dan Brown lives down the street from me, and just imagine what would, he just put out a new Robert Langdon novel, the first one in 8 years. The world is going nuts for it. But imagine if he wrote something different. If he wrote some totally different story, if he decided to write about a dragon or something. Like it just, there's so much money at stake when you get to that level. So, so many different moving parts that nobody's just willing to take any risks anymore.
Do you think that's why some authors decide to have a pen name? Pen name, that's the correct term, isn't it? When they write
pen name, pseudonym.
Yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of them do that. For a while there, that was the publisher too. Like if you wrote something that was different, they would put it out as long as you put it under a different name so they could create that separate brand. And that worked, I think, maybe 15, 20 years ago. But, now with social media and stuff, it's too much work.
Yeah.
Because now all of a sudden you've got 2 Facebook accounts, you've got 2 Twitter accounts, you've got 2 this, 2 that, and you've got to maintain this multiple personality situation. Unless you just, flat out say, this is so-and-so. If you think of like Stephen King, when he did this, he had Richard Bachman, that he used. He basically just grabbed a name out of thin air. He grabbed a picture of somebody that he knew, slapped it on the cover, and that was all he needed to do to create that fake identity, and it worked for years. Then if you flash forward to today, you've got somebody like Nora Roberts. Like she also writes under J.D. Robb. That's no secret. You go to the Nora Roberts website, those other books are there, and it points you over to the other one. And, and they find that if they don't do that, the J.D. Robb books probably weren't selling quite as well until people figured out that Nora Roberts was behind it. So at some point, even if they try to keep it secret, somebody usually lets it slip because they sell more books that way. I'm just looking at all that as a whole. To me, it just makes more sense just to put your own name on the cover of every single one. You just try to keep them similar enough where the reader's going to be along for the ride. And I think pretty much any author could do that if they really set their mind to it.
Now, I know some authors like to have a specific location where they have to write at the same spot all the time. When you're writing, do you have different locations, or do you have one spot that helps with your creativity?
I tend to, we're in my office right now on video. You can kind of see the corner of my desk. So I tend to write in here most days. When I was in the corporate world, though, like I had to squeeze out those words whenever I could, find the time. And I tried to write at least 200 to 300 words a day back then, which is essentially 1 page a day. So you have a novel in about a year. And I would squeeze out words whenever I got a chance. I could be in line at the grocery store. I could be at the airport. I could be in the car at a red light. I listen to a thunderstorm soundtrack whenever I write, basically white noise. And I find that whenever I hear that sound, it's like a Pavlov's dog thing. My brain just snaps into writer mode and knows this is what we're doing. If you can write in the same place every day, you kind of trigger that same response. So I think those kind of things are very important.
That's very interesting. I've never heard of anybody listening to thunder sounds to be able to write, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I've tried like music, but the problem is that my scenes start to kind of play along with the music. So, if the music is fast paced and the scene is fast paced, if it slows down, the scene slows down. If there's lyrics, forget about it. All of a sudden that's going to work into my dialogue. So it influences the storyline too much. But, a good thunderstorm for me, like it drowns out everything else that's going on around me. It kind of makes me feel like I'm in my little writer bubble.
I love thunderstorms.
Yeah.
Wow. So I just lost my train of thought. I only have one more question. I can't believe this. I wrote a whole list here, and some of them I didn't even have to ask you because you just automatically answered the questions for me. So it's almost like you're in my head.
It's all the caffeine.
I didn't have enough today. So I do have to ask, have you had any paranormal experiences yourself in your life?
I've had what I would consider 2. So the very first one, and this was a weird one. So are you familiar with the Stanley Hotel?
Yes.
in Estes Park. So that's the hotel Stephen King actually stayed at with his wife that inspired The Shining.
Yeah.
And my wife and I were out there a few years back for a horror writers retreat. It was me, Josh Mallerman, a guy named Dallas Mayer who wrote under the name Jack Ketchum, and a few others. And we were out there for about a week or so, and we tried everything we possibly could to get some kind of paranormal something or other to happen. You know, at one point we were in the basement at midnight reading scary stories to each other by candlelight, and like that didn't even work. But our very last night there, my wife and I, we woke up, we're laying in bed. It's maybe 9 o'clock in the morning. We're talking, trying to figure out what we're going to do for the day. And all of a sudden the bed just started to shake. And it felt like somebody had grabbed it and was like just rattling it as hard as they possibly could. And it wasn't scary in any way. We were just kind of looking around trying to figure out what is actually doing this, because we weren't near an elevator. Like there was no mechanical cause for it. It was just shaking. It felt very much, if you remember Magic Fingers back in the day, like you drop a quarter in and your bed would vibrate at the hotel. Yeah, it felt like that. It went on for about a minute and then it just stopped. Stopped as quickly as it started, and there was no sound to it. Nothing. It was just the bed just shook. So we went downstairs to get breakfast and we talked to the manager, and he said, "Oh yeah, the bed in that room just does that." And like they had no explanation. It just does that. So I chalked that up as paranormal, even though we've got no idea what it was. The other one for me is when I first went out to Wood Island, where my latest book is based on. This was before I really knew any of the history of that island. And the guy who was restoring it, he let me go into the house, and I stood in the center of that room, and like every bone in my body wanted to get out of there. Like it felt like someplace I did not want to be. Like the hair was standing up on the back of my neck. Everything was just screaming, "Get out, get out, get out." And I had no idea why. And then I started to research the place and learn about all these horrible things that had happened there over years and years. So I think that's more of an instinctual thing. I think a lot of these things, like if that battery theory holds, we're picking up on that, but over years we've kind of learned to tune it out. We ignore it when maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah, I chalk it up to our animal instinct.
Yeah, which we've kind of forgotten, right? If you've got a cat and there's a noise in the corner of the room, that cat is going to bolt. It doesn't care what made the noise. It's just gone. It'll figure it out tomorrow. People are stupid. We will walk over to the corner of the room. We will look around. We'll try to figure out what just made that crazy noise.
Yeah.
This is why the dinosaurs would have probably finished this off if that asteroid didn't get them first. But yeah, animal instincts, I think it's all tied together in some way. We just haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah, we've, like you said, we've stepped away. We've just lost all those instincts because we rely so much on technology. Like for light, for instance, we take light for granted because it doesn't matter what time of night it is. If it's too dark, you just turn a light on.
Yeah, we've gotten spoiled by all that, and we've gotten comforted by it, and we tune out everything else.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe we shouldn't, like you mentioned earlier, because if you tune it out, you're not going to know that danger is around, for example, and it might be too late.
That's how you survive the zombie apocalypse.
So, have you ever been on a paranormal investigation, like with a team or anything like that? And if you haven't, is it something that you would be interested in?
I love that kind of stuff. I've been out to Wood Island a few times with some of the paranormal investigators that we brought out there. I did an overnight stay at a prison in Florida once, which was a lot of fun, with one of those TV shows that was on Sci-Fi.
Nice.
So I love to be part of that. I've yet to see something actually get captured, but it's a fun thing to do.
Yeah, sadly, when you do an investigation, it's not like a lot of the TV shows. You're just sitting in a dark room for hours, and there's not really anything happening. It does get really boring, but sometimes you look back at the evidence and you actually captured something, but it doesn't happen all the time.
Well, they're not there for us, right? They're not performers.
Exactly. Yes. And that's why whenever we do an investigation, we always say, we introduce ourselves, we explain the equipment that we're using, because if someone was in the 1800s, they're not going to know what all these lit boxes are. So we try and describe what they are, how they work. And if it's okay that we're here to talk to you, if you have anything to say, please come tell us. So we're just not asking them to perform on demand.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So can you share what's next for you? Do you have anything in the works that you can give us a little teaser about?
There's always something else going on. I just wrapped up another book with James Patterson. I've got no idea when that's going to come out, but we had a good time writing that. I'm working with a ton of co-authors on my own. I've got about 12 books coming out over the next year between myself and my co-authors. So a lot of stuff happening.
So does that mean when you're working with other people that you're working on multiple books, like perhaps at once?
Yeah, I mean, working with Jim, like he's kind of taught me a lot of what he's doing, and I've been trying to recreate that business model.
Hmm.
So I spend the first couple hours every day writing whatever my current personal book is, and then the rest of the day goes towards working with my co-author titles. I work with
Hmm.
co-authors on working on their outlines, working on their story, working on the actual words for the books. So I try to mix it up.
Is that difficult for you to try and like flicking a switch because you have to go from working with one author, working with another one, and just your standalone books?
I've never had trouble with it. The only
Mm.
time it actually gave me any trouble at all was when I was working on Dracula, mainly because that took place in Victorian England,
Hmm.
and at the time I was also writing a serial killer thriller that took place in modern day Chicago.
Okay.
So like gaslights would work their ways into Chicago, and carriages and things like that, and like those two worlds didn't quite make sense. But for the most part, I've gotten used to it. I've gotten better at it.
Did you catch those, or did an editor catch it?
Oh, I always catch it as
Okay.
I'm going. It's almost like putting on another hat. If I break up the day a little bit, like I do one thing in the morning, another thing in the afternoon, and it's broken up by lunch in between, I'm usually all good.
I actually had the honor in proofreading a book that a friend of mine had written, a paranormal story, and noticed that at one point of the book, the main character had green eyes. Later on, she had different colored eyes, and I'm just like, wait, I'm going through the book, and so I had to message her saying, you might want to pick a color.
I mean, that kind of thing happens. Like I just finished
Yeah.
up a book, and I've been playing with AI quite a bit. And like I would
Oh,
never use
really?
AI for the writing process. I don't think it's capable of that. It's almost like
Hmm.
talking to an encyclopedia. I can't have a creative thought. But
Yeah.
where it is good is for what you just mentioned. It's like I can take an entire book and drop it in there and ask it, are there any plot holes, any idiosyncrasies, anything weird that's been left behind? Like I've got a whole prompt for all these different things, and it'll find this kind of stuff. And like normally human editors will find them, but it's got to go to two, three different people sometimes, and sometimes those
Hmm.
things still slip through. But I'm finding that AI is able to catch a lot of those things ahead of time and help me fine tune the book before it actually gets into the hands of the editor. So it's a great tool for that kind of thing.
I never even thought of using AI for something like that. Yeah, that's
It,
wow.
it, it's it can read the whole book in like 30 seconds. It's ridiculous.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, I really don't have any other questions for you. I'd like to thank you so much for your time. This is a real treat for me. I really appreciate it. Could you tell the audience where they can find you and obviously where they can find your books?
Sure. You can find me at jd.barker.com. I'm on all the social medias. At jd.barker is usually my handle.
Mhm.
Latest book is called Something I Keep Upstairs. That came out in May. And my last book with Patterson was called The Writer. That one came out in March.
Okay, good. Thank you so very much. If you have a moment, hang tight. I'll just say goodbye to the audience and we'll just chat for a couple of minutes if you have the time.
Yep, we're all set. Thank you so
Okay,
much.
thank you very much. Well, folks, that was another great episode. I really liked that one. So a huge thank you to my special guest tonight and to you, my wonderful audience, for tuning in. I also want to thank UPRN 107.7 New Orleans and 105.3 the Gulf Coast for carrying the show. And if you enjoyed tonight's episode, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. It truly means the world to me. And if you'd like to have a little piece of Paranormal Heart podcast to call your own, you can grab some swag, like the mugs that I've been advertising. So by emailing me, you can just drop an email at paranormalheart13@gmail.com, even if it's just to say hello. Until next time, until we meet again, take care of yourselves and each other. Much love to you all.